Hey, friends, welcome to Discovering the Lutheran Faith, Session 1, as we look at the introduction and the story of what we believe as Lutherans. You can't understand the Lutheran faith without first understanding just a little bit of the backstory of how the Lutheran Church came into being. So, who are these Lutherans? So, I want to invite you to turn to page 10 of your workbook, and this tells the story of the Lutheran Church. Who do we call these people Lutherans? Well, the story of the Lutheranism began over 500 years ago when a young monk by the name of Martin Luther was born in Germany, and he was on track to become a lawyer when, as history kind of tells us, he had this near-death incident that literally changed the course and direction of his life. Back in the summer of 1505, Luther was traveling back from the University of Erfurt, where his home was in Mansfield. Now, Luther was studying to be a lawyer, but he didn't want to be a lawyer. That's what his father wanted him to be. So when he was traveling back home, there was this pretty big thunderstorm, and Luther was essentially hiding out behind a rock, and a bolt of lightning flashed in front of him in the fields beside him. And in a moment of panic, Luther cried out these words. He said, "Blessed Saint Anne, I'll become a monk if you save me." And so then he had to go back and tell his father what happened. His father was quite angry, but Luther made a vow, and he was about to keep that vow. So Luther joined a monastery, and later, at the advice of dear friends, left for a place called the University of Wittenberg to study theology. There, he began to learn about the faith, to be able to understand how to read the scriptures. He learned Greek and Hebrew, and he became an accomplished theologian. And on May 2nd, 1507, Luther celebrated his first Mass. That's what we call the celebration of Holy Communion in the Catholic tradition. And Luther was terrified. He was stumbling around. He could barely hold the bread in his hands. In fact, he turned to his Reverend Father and he said these words, "I'm afraid I must leave the altar," he later wrote. I must leave the altar. He couldn't be there anymore. And this is what he wrote. This is what he said about that experience. He said, "How shall I address God, seeing that all men ought to tremble in the presence of an earthly prince? Who am I," Luther said, "that I should lift my eyes or raise my hands to God? The angels surround him, and at his nod the earth trembles. And shall I," and this is how Luther describes himself, "a miserable little pygmy, say, I want this and I ask for that? I'm nothing but dust and ashes and full of sin. Am I supposed to speak to the living, eternal, and true God?" It was here that Luther decided to begin a journey to discover how can people live in relationship to God? How can we have a relationship with God and not always be terrified that somehow God is angry and upset and disappointed in us, but rather, can we truly be at peace with God? Can we live in peace with God? And so in 1510, Luther had the opportunity to visit Rome in order to find, hopefully, comfort for his troubled soul. And so Luther visited many of the churches and monasteries there to celebrate the Mass. He literally would climb on his hands and knees on what it was called the 28 steps that Jesus was supposed to have climbed when he approached Pilate. He walked through catacombs and graveyards of the saints. And Luther came into contact with what is known as relics. These are ancient artifacts that are supposed to have some kind of divine blessing, if you will. In fact, Luther records that he took a look at a crucifix that was once supposed to have spoken, a chain that had held St. Paul in prison. Somehow, the grace of a Samaritan woman who was at the well was bottled up. Some thought they had the rope that was used to drag Jesus to the cross. There was blood and water from his side, some hair from the Blessed Virgin Mary, part of the stone that had sealed Christ's grave, and even the rope that Judas hanged himself with. And during this time, Luther began to ask many questions of the church. He wondered, why was the church so corrupt? Why would priests just go through the motions of performing the Mass so carelessly? What about these relics? Do they really release people from the pains of purgatory? Purgatory is this place that in the Catholic tradition where after you die, you kind of you go to be able to purge yourself of sin and make up for your failings and shortcomings before you enter into heaven. And for Luther, though, the big question was, how do I experience God's grace? Well, Luther went back to Wittenberg, and this is a picture of the modern day Castle Wittenberg, where Luther would stay. And in one of those upper rooms there that you can see in the image with those windows, Luther was in 1514 was studying and teaching theology. And Luther would have what would become known as his light in the tower experience. You can see that light tower up there. That's kind of where we get the reference from. Luther was reading through the book of Romans, and he realized that the peace that he was longing for was found in these words from Romans chapter 1, beginning at verse 16. Here's what it says: For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God for the salvation of everyone. Luther included himself in that. Everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel message of Jesus, a righteousness, and that word righteousness just simply means, how am I right with God? How can I have a right and good relationship with God? Well, Luther said that the gospel reveals to us a righteousness from God, a righteousness, as he'll later discover, not based on performance or actions or behavior, but a righteousness that is by faith, trusting in God, right? From the first to the last, that the righteous will live by faith. And in that moment, everything began to change for Luther. Luther began to comprehend the power of God's grace and the gift of righteousness. And he began to see that the church was in serious need of reform. So in October of 1517, Luther posted what is now known as the 95 Theses on the door of the Church of Wittenberg. What Luther wanted to do was simply debate. He wanted to have discussions. He wanted to clarify what we believe, teach, and confess. He wanted to see reform in the abuses that he saw. And so Luther's main argument was against what was known as the selling of indulgences. He saw problems with the way people worshiped. He felt the authority of the church had gotten out of hand, especially related to the Pope and his authority over Scripture. Luther never intended to break away from the church. In fact, the Lutheran Church really believes that we want to stand in a continuum from Jesus, the apostles, the early church fathers, the early church to our modern existence. We want to stand in what's called an unbroken line. We never intended to break away from the church. We wanted to simply the church reform and get back to fixing our eyes on Jesus. But eventually, the followers of Luther and Luther himself he had to make a decision. And so in 1521, Luther was called to stand before the church, and especially before Prince Charles and what we call various high church officials. There, he was called upon to essentially recant his position or be labeled a heretic within the Catholic Church. And so there's this scene where this table is spread out and all of Luther's writings in there. And essentially they say, will you basically reject everything that you wrote and taught? And in this moment, Luther actually has a crisis of faith. He actually asks for 24 hours to think about his answer. And in the middle of the night, he has this horrible, horrible spiritual battle with the devil. He's fighting with the devil. He's warring with the devil. He's calling the devil a liar and a betrayer. And in that moment, he took great comfort in the words of Psalm 46, my God is a fortress and a refuge. And that became the impetus for actually writing the song, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And so Luther came back and he stood before the councils and he gave this beautiful speech about how he will not and could not recant unless convinced by plain reason and scripture. And this is what we call the Here I Stand speech. Eventually, the Lutherans in 1530 would formally break free from the Catholic Church with the presentation of a document we call the Augsburg Confession. There we outline our what we call the 26 articles of faith, the things that we believe, teach, and confess about God to be true. This eventually led to what was known as the launch of the Protestant Reformation. It was like a powder keg that got set off first in Germany and then in Sweden and then several other places, including England. And just the church began to fracture and splinter. And that's unfortunate. We don't want the church to be divided. But at the same time, we can't give up what is true. And this is why we have Lutherans and Calvinists and Zwinglies and Anglicans and Baptists and all the different denominations that flow from those beginning traditions. Now, at the heart of the Reformation, this is where we're going to end this session. At the heart of the Reformation is what we call these three great solas. So if you look on page 13, you'll see a map of kind of how the divisions of the breakdown of the Protestant Reformation formed. And at the hallmark of the Reformation is the three great solas: sola gratia, sola fide, sola scriptura. And so when you begin to understand who we are here at Good Shepherd, we build our church around these three things: grace alone, faith alone, word alone. Grace, that's the kindness that God shows his people, even though they don't deserve it. Faith, it is a confident trust in the work of God, the completed work of Jesus on the cross, and the promises that God has made, has kept, and will keep on our behalf. And then finally, the word. We stand firmly on the inspired scriptures as the rule of our faith, as the norm of our faith that teaches us what we believe about God. And so everything that we're going to look at over the next few sessions is going to unpack these truths. All right, friends, you'll continue now with part two of the introduction as we look at kind of up close picture of how Good Shepherd came into formation.